Welcome today's webinar on behaviour-based safety, or more specifically, behaviour-based safety 2.0, next generation. I'd like to introduce Douglas Hamilton from Concentris and Adele Lawson from behaviour, who will be joining me today on this webinar. So, our goal, excellence in safety and zero accidents. Behaviour-based safety 2.0 is a toolkit which we've developed in combination with PHSS, behaviour Lawson and Concentris. It's a joint effort in developing. Today's webinar, as I've said, will be presented largely myself and supported by both Adele and Douglas. And I've had the pleasure to work with Douglas before in a number of organisations, and I've been working with Adele more recently on projects in the Middle East. So we all know each other fairly well and our strengths, and indeed what our weaknesses are. So one of the things I wanted to start with by saying what is kind of different about BBS. I will deal with this in a little bit more detail. One of the things we are conscious of is that we are looking for a holistic change program. A program that reaches all parts of the organisation, and it aims to influence the organisational culture and individual behaviours and what's between those two parameters. A lot of the people who are joining us today are from a wide variety of backgrounds: operational, health and safety, behaviour-based safety experts. So we've got quite a wide range of people participating today, and we've tried to make this presentation reach out to all of those groups. So it's not majoring perhaps necessarily on psychology, it's not necessarily majoring on operations. It's trying to put all of these parts together to create one whole. When I think about my experience when I'm doing root cause analysis on safety incidents, and I either apply Swiss cheese model or domino theory of accident causation, I generally reflect as I'm getting deeper and deeper into an accident investigation, just all parts of the organisation generally involved, from leadership down to the workplace. And what my experience of behaviour-based safety has been, certainly over the last 10 years or so, is largely focused on workplace, the workforce at the point at which work takes place. BBS 2.0, what we're looking at here, is making sure we bring in the wider organisation, this holistic change programme, which in all parts of the organisation, as I've said before, influences organisational culture and indeed individual behaviours. Many of us joining today will recognise that for some of us, achieving excellence, and of course that goal of zero accidents, is just that, it still remains a goal. And so therefore there is much work still to do. We see BBS 2.0 as the next generation of behaviour-based safety that can actually help you take that to the next step in your goal towards excellence in safety. So what is BBS 2.0? Fundamentally, and one of the key aspects of behaviour-based safety 2.0 is the utilisation of coaching, mentoring and peer-to-peer conversations. So we see that as the glue or the binding agent, if you will. It helps to drive and keep momentum. Importantly, it also helps to sustain the gains. So it's a part of the BBS 2.0 programme that provides sustainability and momentum. As I mentioned before, BBS 2.0 is organisation-wide, holistic by design, and fundamentally seeks to influence both individual behaviours to fundamentally change organisation culture. The tools largely we're using have 5 key components. We start at the bottom and go clockwise through this slide. Leadership, it starts with leadership. We accept that leaders have a huge role to play in the launching, implementation and sustaining of this programme. We realise the need to align leadership behaviours with everyone in the workplace. So for us, BBS 2.0 starts there. It then moves into organisational wide engagement. We look to design and develop the modelling of exemplar safe behaviours at all levels of the organisation. From there, we move on to the development of the tools. We deploy tried and tested tools for certain aspects of what we're doing. We're also adapting and developing tools, perhaps in a more agile way to reflect certain cultural issues, or perhaps different sectors, or perhaps different issues within different organisations. Following on from the deployment of the tools, we move towards that behavioural shift, generating that collective change, which becomes the way in which starts to happen. And fundamentally moving towards a shift in culture. As I mentioned earlier on, in doing my kind of root cause analysis type work and investigating accidents, and when I apply Swiss cheese model or indeed domino theory of accident causation, what we see is failures at different levels. When we focus on just the workplace, the workspace, just with workers, the direct accident causation, we often fail to recognise behavioural negativity further up the organisation, or indeed in support areas within the organisation. So BBS 2.0 seeks to pull all of that in, and I'm just going to give you some examples of that. If you think about procurement, if you think about purchasing services, and if you think about negative behaviours which may perhaps be complacency within procurement, then that may lead to contract with the wrong type of organisation providing services on your behalf. So whilst that would not be picked up in behavioural-based safety at the front line, it would certainly be picked up through behaviour-based safety 2.0 as part of our holistic approach. Because what we seek to do is change behaviours not just within the workforce, and also, as I've said before, these behaviours within other parts of the organisation that perhaps we don't necessarily touch that often in terms of safety. And apologies for any procurement colleagues who maybe have joined us today, but procurement to me is an area perhaps where safety professionals maybe need to do a little bit more in terms of behaviour-based change. And that's something certain that we recognise. And again, if you look back at your accident causation, well, yes, absolutely, direct cause very often focused very much in the workplace and in the workspace where work took place. But again, when you look at those models, domino theory of accident causation and Swiss cheese, you go back up and you begin to see that actually there are some behaviours that sit maybe in leadership, maybe in management, maybe in supervision, or maybe in support services, including indeed our finance colleagues in the finance department, that behaviour-based safety should perhaps be taken to. And that's part of what we see as a key element to this change.
Hi David, it's Lorraine here at Project Health and Safety Services. Just to say that we've had a couple of messages through just to say that your sound quality is breaking up a little bit. Yes, I don't know if it's something to do with your microphone. Just wanted to double check that.
Okay, I'll try. I'm not sure if I can change much of that just now. I'll try and adapt it.
Just to stay a little bit closer to the laptop, perhaps.
Okay, I shall do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, when it goes wrong, can I perhaps invite you just to take a moment and picture in your own mind's eye what it looks like in your own workplace when it goes wrong, when the behaviours aren't right. These pictures are examples of that, but just take a minute and just think in your sector, in your organisation, in your department, what does it look like when those behaviours aren't quite right? Just take a minute to do that. Thank you. Okay, so you should all have an image in your mind that you don't want to see in reality. And BBS 2.0, we're looking to make sure that those images that you have in your mind, those things that keep you awake at night, actually never manifest themselves on the ground. Okay, so I'm going to ask Doug to talk us through in a little bit more detail about what's different between, let's say, historical behaviour-based safety programs and what we're doing with behaviour-based safety 2.0. Doug.
Thanks, David, and hello to everyone. I saw the messages coming in there about the sound, so I'll try and project my voice and speak clearly, and I'm sure Lorraine will step in if she needs to, just to keep us on track. So this slide outlines the difference between what we might regard as historic BBS, behaviour-based safety, and what we might regard as new model behaviour-based safety, or BBS 2.0. So I want to run through these quickly and just give us an idea about how we see this working in practice. Now, some of you who have worked with these programs before will possibly recognise this. That's fine. For others, it may be new learning. Again, that's fine. But we'll just run through these just now as we go through this slide. So first, let's look at what we mean by historic BBS, and by that we mean the evolution of the original version, which grew out of oil, gas, and petrochem in the 1970s to 1980s, and that's based on very well-established principles. Now, typically these would include the first step of analysing risk patterns in your operations from trailing data. So what are your injuries or your incidents actually telling you about safety in your business? You would then go on to identify behaviours to address these risks. And it's important that we understand the definition of behaviour as being what we say and what we do. That's the classic definition of behaviour that we're going to work with from this point on. So we establish the behaviours that we think will combat these risks. We would then go out and carry out some kind of observation and measurement program. Usually you'll see people out with a checklist where they're observing what's going on at the front line, and where unsafe behaviours are spotted, there would be an intervention carried out, some kind of engagement discussion to try to correct that behaviour. Where, though you see the safe ones going on, it is really crucial that you support them through positive feedback and intervention. And in my own experience, that is one of the components that is most often missing in action. So where behaviour-based safety programmes have historically fallen down, my own experience, for what it's worth, is it's usually because they lack that element, or they lack it being consistently applied. Now, the principles of that model, the historic BBS, are still very much valid. So we recognise them as having value, but there are some drawbacks associated with this approach. And typically these include things like, as David has mentioned, being aimed primarily at the front line or the workforce, rather than across the whole organisation. Secondly, a tendency to blame the worker when something goes wrong, even if it is a genuine mistake or error that takes place. And a number of times I've heard the expression along the lines of "sack the idiot who made the mistake." It typifies that kind of approach. So that erodes trust in a BBS program, and it will reduce for you the likelihood of injuries or incidents being reported, which of course is what we all want. Thirdly, we have a limited use of behavioural KPIs for measurable change. So when you're generating data to try to show success, it can be seen as irrelevant, or it can be seen as difficult to understand. I think it's fair to say also in the past that the market was taken up with branded models, which didn't often fit specific client needs. So the core principles of some of these models, at least, didn't often connect with people in a way which created change. Now, I've dealt with various organisations over the last few years who spent a lot of time and a lot of money on branded programs that they now recognise didn't really create any real change in behavioural patterns, primarily because they didn't actually address the key understanding of why we do what we do, minute by minute and day by day. And I think that the last thing we'd want to touch on in terms of the drawbacks from historic models is what we might describe as a failure to adapt a program to the cultural norms of the situation. Now, when I talk about cultural norms, what do I mean? I've broken this down into three parts. Number one, sector-specific norms. So if you operate in an oil, gas, or petrochem background, the way you approach safety within your organisation will differ markedly, for argument's sake, from a construction setting. That's just a simple truth. Secondly, we have geography-specific cultural ideas. So I've worked in the US. They differ greatly from Europe in terms of their approach towards safety. And thirdly, you might have what you call society-specific norms. So for instance, when I was working in Singapore a few years ago, there was, with apologies to anybody who hails from Singapore, a definite boss class mentality amongst the managers in relation to the way they conducted themselves towards low-skilled migrant workers. And that just eroded trust, and it eroded the ability to actually build something which was successful for the whole organisation. So these are some of the drawbacks that we might see in a programme like that. Now, if we were going to try to address them, how would we do so? Well, as David has mentioned, we propose a more all-embracing approach to BBS under the 2.0 model. It's aimed at culture and behaviour change across the whole organisation, not just the workforce, from boardroom to your work location. And in a BBS programme like this, everyone's behaviour has to change, not just one part of the organisation. Secondly, don't look at the worker to blame them for what they do. Look at the environment, the working environment that you are putting them in, and shape it accordingly for what you're actually looking for. What do people experience day by day? Because their behaviours will be driven by that, and what they believe the right things are to do in these situations, even if that's not what you say you want. So if you come out with an organisational norm that says safety is our #1 value, but you perhaps unwittingly value production over safety, that's what you're going to get. Thirdly, use a low number of measures which are relevant to all levels of the organisation, so that your KPIs are understandable across the whole organisation, and they're based on ones that are around behaviour first and foremost, to drive safety performance forward as leading factors. And finally, use a model designed from core behavioural science principles and fully customised to your needs. So again, just to recap on what we mean by that, behaviour can be identified as specific actions which people take. It's what we say or what we do. Therefore, it can be observed, it can be measured, so we can track its patterns, and that allows us to understand whether we are creating real change in those patterns, which lead to a longer-term change in safety culture. And as I say, that has not always been part of traditional behavioural safety models, but we believe it's a key component of what you need to do in order to implement this effectively in your own organisation. The next slide is a bit of a tag team between David and I, but I'm going to let him take the first point on this slide.
Yeah, thank you for that, Doug. I'm sure that will raise a number of questions. I should say that if you do have questions, please use the Q&A. We will attempt to answer some of the questions at the end of this webinar. And for those that we don't answer, we will come back to you specifically and directly by email over the coming days. But yes, as Doug says, you know, we've got our own particular approach to how we deploy BBS 2.0. It's in 3 phases. Doug mentioned customization in his previous slide, and what we seek to do is create a diagnostic tool, a diagnostic assessment, if you will, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail about in the roadmap, which will come soon, where we determine and help the organisation determine where they are in terms of health and safety and maturity. And it's against a range of key behavioural safety criteria. Now, what we've sought to do here is not make this diagnostic assessment in any way contentious. We've tried to make this, let's say, more meaningful from the perspective of people understanding where they are now and moving intelligently towards a better state. Some diagnostic tools can use quite emotive words, and we've deliberately tried to avoid that. What we then seek to do is establish with yourself as an organisation what your target operating model for health and safety will look like. In other words, where do you want to be? I'll ask Doug just to explain the other 2 phases.
Thanks, David. So step 1 is a fairly accepted way in business of analysing where you are against where you want to be, and some of you will have seen that before. Steps 2 and 3 perhaps though need a little bit more definition around them. The gap analysis and defining behaviours is a less well-defined standard step. What we tend to find happening here is that behaviours tend to be expressed in generalities. So the type of things that people come out with there are, we need to communicate better, we need to engage more. Now, I'm not knocking these as ideas, they have their value, but they don't have any real force until you can pinpoint them as behaviours for each part of your business. So let me give you an example on this. If you said that you wanted to develop better engagement with your workforce, we might suggest you would translate that into a targeted action, a targeted behaviour, where you run participation reviews with your workforce on method statements every 6 months. That gives them the opportunity to input to how the method statements are designed. It gives them the feeling of empowerment, and it gives you a much better feel for how you can interact with them. Now, perhaps wise to say here that if you operate to some kind of accredited standard, for instance, I'll pick 45001. If you operate to ISO 45001, you should have, I say you should have, the expectation that these standards call out the correct type of behaviours across your organisation anyway. But do they? In our experience, the accreditation is sometimes there just to act as a certificate on the wall. It's there to be defended. You've gone through a long process to get this accreditation. The certificate is on the wall, and the main purpose is to keep it there. So when your auditor comes in once a year, your main aim is to make sure that you maintain that accreditation, rather than asking yourself, what does this do for us as a business, and how can we translate that into workable behaviours that really improve our performance in health and safety? So we see BBS 2.0 as very much aligned with that. Now, if we then move on to the third strand, the third step rather, I would suggest to you that that has 3 strands, and they are training, coaching, and measurement or use of KPIs. Now, any successful behavioural programme has to be based on a positive support mentality for the behaviours you want. I've touched on that already. And the truth is that consequences or outcomes for behaviours drive those behaviours at every level. And we'll touch on the type of behaviours that we're looking for in later slides. As David has mentioned, we want to stress a leading approach in the coaching sphere because we have people who understand leading coaching techniques and can help you with them. And they're also experienced in the sectors which are represented here today in our audience. So we have people from across the globe. We have people from all different sectors of industry, technical support, manufacturing, construction, project delivery, and we are experienced in working in these sectors. So our coaching is relevant, we would suggest, to the sectors that you're in. Now, just a couple of things to say about what we mean by safety coaching. Previous safety coaching has been well-intentioned, but sometimes it can fall into the trap that we mentioned previously. It's workforce focused, it's negatively worded. The techniques that we use here are drawn from best practice across the globe, and we have a number of techniques that we can deploy to help in that respect. Now, none of these is what the Americans would call a slam dunk in themselves, but they do form tools that we can use when the situation calls for it. A word of caution, though, that will present challenges for you in terms of your business leadership and for those around you. Because as humans, we are very comfortable doing what we currently do. Otherwise, we wouldn't do it. And many of us, as safety professionals especially, I find out, are used to directing and controlling safety through instructions. So changing our approach to a coaching one can be quite tricky. And I've seen many situations where people think that coaching is simply instructing someone on what to do with limited or no communication back. Now, I came across a great quote on this front recently, that leaders are more powerful role models when they learn than when they teach. And that's part and parcel, we would suggest, of the best style of coaching approach that you can take. So we would aim that the coaching and influencing creates what you might call a rising tide of behavioural improvement across the business to align everyone on a common cultural basis. Now, I'm just going to move on to the next slide, and I hope you can see that now. When you run a program properly, you're going to need to measure changed behaviours. And so you're going to collect data, and you're going to want to analyse the data to see what that is telling you about how you're doing. Perfectly understandable. Now, we would aim to integrate the outputs of BBS 2.0 with your own systems where we can. So if you run something like an ERP, an enterprise resource platform, or some type of HSE management system or software suite, we would aim wherever we can to integrate what we do with that so that the measures are consistent with how they are reported within your existing regimes. Some of you may be in a situation where you need new tools. Now, these can be introduced and trained and rolled out as you need to. And I've categorized these in three areas. First off, we have what you might call system tools. So, for instance, we have worked with BIM 360, where you're storing records, observations that are carried out on safety inspections and so on. SharePoint is obviously a tool that we've used as well, and that's something that we can deploy if we need to. Secondly, we've got what we might call social tools, and this is a great value add where you have a team and you want to get them to collaborate. Again, some of you will use them already. One we've used recently, for instance, is Workplace, which is Facebook's tool for team collaboration and information sharing. That works very well. And thirdly, we have what we call behaviour-specific tools. We've actually developed our own app for gathering field BBS data and analysing it. And that, again, is a tool that we can deploy if we need to do so. We can also back that up with technical tools such as VR, virtual reality, and remote analysis of incidents. And I would suggest to you that VR is especially useful in situational awareness settings. So what we're talking about there are random events where you don't get a chance to rehearse how to respond. Something happens and you've been told on how to respond to it, but you've never had the chance to practice it before. The VR gives you a chance to do that, because our natural responses in situations like that may not be the safest of ones. So it's important to get the chance to practice them as best we can, and so they become part of our muscle and brain memory. And that it increases the chance that you're going to get the behaviours that you want if and when you ever need to call on them. With that, I'm going to hand back to David for the next slide.
Thank you, Doug. Very informative. So I mentioned earlier about the three phases. Doug and I spoke in a bit of detail about those three. Phase one, just wanted to spend a little bit more time on that, is the diagnostic, or the safety culture roadmap, as we've called it in this instance. I also mentioned the fact that in terms of these phases and the stages that sit within phase one, we did not want to make these confrontational or let's say a little bit more edgy than necessarily they should be. So we went for terms such as basic, developing, to systemized, working with a fairly well-developed health and safety management system, maybe fragmented, not fully implemented, and then moving into a kind of proactive policy to practices, fully implemented, positive company-wide engagement, and KPI results that demonstrate success. And Doug did mention a little bit in his discussion there around KPIs, actionable information. One of the aspects of behaviour-based safety in the past has been a large volume of data generated and probably some issues in and around how that data finds itself as actionable information. So again, for us, and Doug and I had long conversations about this, how do we get the data, first of all, collected in such a way that isn't taking up too much time, and also that it's used in such a way that the information is absolutely actionable and it's adding value to where you're going on this safety culture. So 4 stages: basic, developing, systemised, and proactive. Part of our task in phase one, when we come in and talk to organisations, would be to work with the leadership and management team to go through that diagnostic process and by consensus agree where we are. With that, we set the baseline and we can start working towards what will be the future mission of the organisation. In terms of the development of that future roadmap, that becomes absolutely key. Another aspect of behaviour-based safety, which we are determined is an important lever, and we mentioned that this is a whole organisation, it's a holistic programme. We wanted to set principles that, whilst we might not necessarily at this stage develop out into what the key behaviours we would expect of leaders, key behaviours underpinned by principles. So we've set principles for leadership, we've set principles for management, and we've set principles for colleagues. The leadership principles are, critically, that leaders take responsibility for the establishment of a positive prevention culture. That leaders prioritise OSH policies above other corporate objectives. Doug mentioned that earlier. That the leadership gain unequivocal commitment of an organisation's board and senior management to this action plan. Now it's done in a cultivated, open atmosphere, and at all times we are valuing and engaging with all our employees in the programme. And that's where the coaching, the mentoring, the peer-to-peer conversations piece really comes in. And that's where the strength of that part of the programme really does resonate. And similarly, we have 5 principles for management, where we're expecting managers always to set that positive example. We're expecting managers to challenge unsafe behaviours and to suggest improvement. And again, if we reflect back on what we said about the whole organisation, whether indeed that be in finance or whether that be in procurement, then managers need to be in that position to challenge behaviours that, whilst you might not necessarily see them traditionally as unsafe. So for example, cutting the budget on one aspect of safety, whilst you might not necessarily see as let's say, an explicit unsafe behaviour, it will have an impact. And it's one of the reasons that we see this as being a holistic programme that does reach all those parts of the service organisation and support organisation within the business. We expect managers to engage teams to adopt safe behaviours for both moral and business reasons. We want management to set challenging health and safety objectives. We equally want management to hold people accountable for improving performance, but in a just way. A key bit in this, which is we spoke about a few times now, is the enabler, coach, and facilitator. So this is a big challenge for management to step into this role. Very often they are instruction driven and may not see themselves as enablers and indeed coaches. And this might not be comfortable territory for many managers. So again, we recognise that in BBS 2.0. This is a big piece of work that requires to be done if you undertake a programme such as this. I'm going to ask Doug to talk a little bit about the principles for colleagues. Doug has got a lot of experience in everyday safety within workforces across a range of sectors. So I'm going to ask Doug just to say a little bit about these principles and utilise his experience.
Thanks, David. I'm not going to talk through these in detail, folks, but I hope you will understand that when we see them there, they are good ones to work with. Challenging peers when we see unsafe working practices, stopping work and taking corrective action, and so on. So these 5 principles that are down there, I hope you would recognise them as being good ones for any workforce to adopt. But as with the other categories of behaviour that we've seen there, some of the natural consequences or outcomes for these behaviours will be quite difficult. If you're in a situation where you see one of your peers or one of your mates working unsafely, and you go across and challenge them, what is going to happen to you? They might react well, they might react badly, they might punch you in the face. So the key motivator for these behaviours is to support them in any way we can. And that's where we have to think about the working environment that you're in each day and the stream of consequences, if you like, that you're bringing to the workforce each day. It depends on day-to-day, moment-to-moment interactions. So you develop trust in the people around you, you empower them to take decisions, and you support them when they do so. Now, I want to give you just a brief example here of a project I was working on recently, where a guy was taking delivery of a lorry load of materials. Now, the materials were crucial for the production on the site that day. So the lorry turned up with the materials on them. The guy who was offloading them took one look at the lorry and thought to himself, I don't like the look of the way these materials are stacked there. If I unload these materials the way they are stacked, they could fall off. They could create an incident or injury. So he went to his supervisor and he said to him, look, we've got a problem here with the way these materials are stacked. And I think we should send the materials back so they can get restacked before we actually are able to offload them safely. His supervisor, to his credit, backed him and said, okay, that's your call. I agree with you on that. Let's send them back. So they did. The materials were restacked. The lorry came back later in the day with the materials stacked differently. The production for the day was slowed up, but they took the safe decision and they were supported for it. Now, let's just think about that for a moment. The guy who took that decision wouldn't have acted that way if he hadn't been encouraged to do so. So he'd heard this message in his briefings, act safely, safety comes first, and so on. But the proof of the pudding for him was when he took that decision and when his supervisor backed him. He received a set of what we might call positive outcomes or consequences for his action. His supervisor backed him. He knew taking the right decision. He gets a sense of being empowered to do the right thing, and he gets recognition and reward from the project team. And that's the type of interaction that we're talking about that needs to happen on a daily basis to embed the behaviours you want as part of the whole company approach to safety improvement. And it also cuts to an idea of what you might call psychological safety. Now, some of you might have come across this before, but this is a key component in our approach. The idea is that you can say something or you can take a course of action that you believe to be right without fear of what comes afterwards. And the two key building blocks for you in that are effective engagement and effective feedback. They go hand in hand. So these are two crucial components for you in terms of building trust and in building the type of organizational culture and safety culture that you would want. With that, I'm going to hand back to David for the next slide.
Thank you, Doug. And again, just really like to invite the audience to take a moment and indulge yourself this time to envisage in your mind's eye what getting it right in your organization could look like. You know, what would the interaction, what would the engagement, what would the conversations look like when you deploy an effective BBS 2.0 program? Just imagine what that looks like. And you're comparing and contrasting that with our initial photographic slide, which was showing perhaps behaviours we don't want to see in our organisation. Take a minute to do it. Okay, so I'm sure that conjured up some really interesting images and allowed you to kind of envisage what might be. We have had some questions and we've got a few we're going to try and answer. As I mentioned earlier on, if you don't get your question answered during this session, then don't be alarmed. We will come back to you by email with a full comprehensive answer. But I'll lead and I'll talk through basically some of the questions we've had between myself and Douglas. The one question was how long typically does it take to deploy BBS 2.0? The answer to that is obviously each organisation is different. However, we do estimate that it would take around 3 months, perhaps consultancy time, to set out the diagnostic and the development of a clear plan. After that 3-month period, call it inception period, if you will, we would work with each organisation probably over a further 6 to 9 months, but not to the same intensity, where we would be supporting the group that are leading on BBS 2.0 within the business with the implementation of the various tools and to obviously work with the organisation to train and develop in-house support for the deployment and sustainable approach to BBS 2.0. So 3 months initially, and then probably a 6 to 9 month support period. I'll let Doug answer the next one, but the question is, how does BBS 2.0 differ from other behaviour-based programs?
Thanks, David. Yeah, we did try to touch on this to some extent when we were going through the presentation, but I just want to maybe pick up on a couple of points. Again, just to stress that a lot of behaviour-based programs or so-called behaviour-based programs focus on a central phrase or a slogan without any real force behind how to create the behavioural change you need. Now, it's not difficult to draft an inspiring vision or a statement about what you want your company to look like. And we would always encourage you to do that as something that people can rally behind. But the challenge, again, is in translating that into workable behaviours, which can be sustained until they become the norm for you. What we can say, or what we believe to be true, is that we believe our programme is practical, we believe it's workable, and we believe it's based on proven measurable success. And we're aiming to engage the whole company in change, as we said before, or the whole organization in change, and to align that change with your existing systems or processes that are aimed to deliver safety effectively.
Thanks, Doug.
David, I think you're taking the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So, further question, why are we emphasising the use of coaching and mentoring within the BBS 2.0 programme? Well, put simply, we believe that to generate organisation-wide engagement, a combination of coaching, mentoring, and peer-to-peer conversations or dialogue is absolutely vital. As I mentioned before, we see it as the binding agent. We see it as the means by which the programme will be sustainable and grow and develop. So no real secret behind that, a pretty pragmatic approach to developing sustainability. Further question, this time I'll ask Doug to respond, is how does BBS 2.0 differ from just culture?
Yeah, so some of you will be familiar with the idea of just culture and will have read up on it. And we believe that we are exactly aligned with these principles. My own view is that a just culture is what you're trying to create. So it's not a program or a process in itself. It's the end result of what you're trying to do. So it should be an output of the behaviours in your organisation, again, from boardroom down to workplace. And if your company or your organisation gets them right, you create the situation for a just culture to flourish. So what we aim to do is to help you identify and deliver these behaviours across the company. David, I think the next one's yours.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So how would we sum up the main outputs from a BBS 2.0 programme? Well, we see them as firstly a well-defined goal, supported by a plan emerging from the safety culture roadmap and the diagnostic tool which we've spoken about in some detail. The provision of a well-defined behaviour-based principles and safe behaviour definitions, alongside a comprehensive observation toolkit. So the coaching and mentoring programme, combined with an intelligent measuring tool, providing what we mentioned before, actionable information that moves the business along in its journey towards its goal, safety excellence and zero accidents. So a further question, this time for Doug. He mentioned the term situational awareness. What does he mean by that?
Yeah, again, just to expand on that, some of you may have come across this before, and particularly we find people who are ex-military, if you spent time in the military or perhaps in public services like the police. This is a term which is generally reckoned to have come from military thinking, and it's the idea that you are awake to the situation that you're in any one time and the risks that are posed to you as a result. Now, we can often walk into situations thinking that we know what's going on around us, but without really being fully aware of the risks that are actually there. And these can be the type of situations that generate significant harm for you, a routine task where something has changed in the period between when a person was first looking at it to when they come back to it. For instance, if they've taken a lunch break, or something changes overnight and then they come back to the task the next day, they don't assess the situation properly, they start their work, and before they know it, they're in trouble. So it's about being perceptive to understanding the risks and managing them in the correct way. And there are defined ways of doing this. We have models that we can bring in, which we would hope to introduce as part of BBS 2.0 with you. David, again, back to yourself.
Thank you, Doug. So we did touch a little bit on training, and one of the questions is asked us about what types of innovative training do you see being used for BBS 2.0? Doug did touch on it, and I'm just going to talk a little bit more about it because I've used this training mechanism a couple of times now. So for some people, they'll be well used to it, but the use of virtual reality and augmented reality now in a behaviour-based change programme actually fits, in our opinion, very well. It provides that really realistic, immersive, safe environment that actually can make a real difference. Part of the problem when you talk about VR and AR, people very often think it's very high cost, and whilst there is a cost to it, it can actually be done in quite a lean way. And one of the things I like about VR, certainly as part of backbone to a BBS type program is it can be deployed quite quickly, and it can be deployed on a mass basis, and it does give people that realistic, immersive experience that really does help change thinking. So that's one of the areas that we certainly would see as being innovative as far as this training is concerned. So I'm now going to ask both Doug and Adele to answer the next question, because I think it probably relates to a lot more of their experience than mine. So how do you think differing safety cultures around the world can adapt to something such as BBS 2.0? So maybe, Doug, do you want to start with that and pass over to Adele?
Actually, I'll let Adele lead off on this, if that's okay.
Very kind of you.
Cheers, Doug. Thank you. I mean, I think the cultural aspect does really influence this. Now, when we talk about the culture side of things, I'm not just talking about cultures within certain countries. Yes, that makes a difference. The background, nationality, religion, that does play a very, very big difference when it comes to health and safety in organization. But it's also the organizational culture itself. So we have to look at both these elements, what the national culture is and also what the organization culture is. Because a lot of times when we look at the organizational culture, what's the basic culture for the client or for the client organizations? We might have a lot of contractors might be joining that client organization, and they would adapt to the behaviors that the client organization have. So this is one of the aspects when we look at culture. But culture, again, it does play a very, very big difference. And I think with what Doug was saying about it needs to be tailored to various cultures, comes into play here. And you do need to understand the exact culture within the country, how things work, how leadership works there, understand the leadership side of things, but also, again, do your diagnostics and understand how everything ticks within that organization. And there's a number of methodologies or diagnostics that you can use to actually understand that and obviously get to the scale. I mean, we talked about the scale before of where people are on various organizations. So at the end of the day, when you're doing that initial gap analysis, when you're doing that initial diagnostic, you can find out where each organization is on that culture and then start working from there. And again, that's probably one of the reasons why sometimes companies do apply behavioral based safety programs and it doesn't work, because like Doug said, again, they basically will take something that is generic and they think that, okay, we'll apply it to our organization and this will definitely work. But that's not the case, because those considerations haven't been taken into place. And then just, sorry, Doug, again, or David, I wanted to add something else as well. And this is a very important thing to always consider. Behavioral based safety could actually be your biggest risk within the business, all right? Then you have to be very, very careful about this. Not all organizations can apply behavioral-based safety program. A lot of your basic things, your basic health and safety, your ABCs need to be in an organization first. So just because you basically apply a behavioral-based safety programs does not mean everything is going to be honky-dory or perfect. You need to have your basic things in place, and organizations really, really need to understand that. So again, going back to various economies, different cultures, that kind of comes into play a lot of times, right? So the basics sometimes are not there, and organizations will come and apply a behavioral-based safety program when those considerations have not already been made, and a lot of times they fail, but they don't realize that you have to start with those basics as well. So sorry, Doug, if I took too much time there. I'll hand that back to you.
No, that's fine, Adele. No, I mean, listen, it's a valid point, and I if I might just add to that, I think that what you've talked about there is part of behaviour-based safety across an organisation anyway. If you're not putting these things in place through your own behaviours, then you're right, the whole thing and the whole effort is wasted. So we need to look at these management techniques at that level as much as we look at it at the traditional way that we've thought about behaviour-based safety. I mean, from my point of view, I go back to what I said earlier on, that we believe we've got a model which will succeed. but you will have different challenges based on where you are, your prevailing local culture, your prevailing company culture. Incidentally, just thanks to people who've been sending questions in here, but there's one that reads here: safety is when the manager and supervisor are not looking. Absolutely. That defines your safety culture, it defines how you perform as an organization. And I think you just need to be awake to where you are and awake to what happens when you're in that situation. But that's what you should be doing anyway. You don't have a uniform bunch of clones in your team. You deal with them differently based on who they are. And so this is just the same principle represented on a wider footing when you're dealing with people in different settings. Okay, I think I should probably shut up on that one, David, and hand back to you.
No, that's fine. That's fine, Doug. I think I'm going to end with one final question, if you don't mind, and then I think we'll move on to a summary, because we've obviously spent quite a bit of everybody's time today, 45 minutes and beyond. So I'm just going to finish with one final question, and that is, what realistically would be a time frame for changing organisational safety culture? And again, I suppose my answer to that, there's no point in over-optimising that. There's no point in me trying to oversell what that might look like in terms of time and trying to play down the length of time it would take. You know, we are all experienced in either being directors responsible for health and safety or for managing health and safety as a practitioner. And we know what it takes to make these changes. And Adele's response there has also outlined some of that. You know, there's a deployment of the basics, and there is a moving up, you know, of your plan, of your sophistication in terms of how you will change culture in your organisation. So there's clearly a medium-term goal we want to set, short and medium-term goals. But if I was to take a kind of general view in business, you know, I don't think that safety culture could be changed in anywhere less a time frame than between 2 to 5 years. I do see it as a sort of medium-term, long-term objective. And thereafter, the critical piece is how do you sustain that as new people come into your organisation, as your organisation may grow, as it may go into different sectors and change. And that complicates this cultural stability even further. So with that, I'm going to ask Doug to just provide a bit of a summary to our webinar today.
Thanks, David. Yes, and we'll keep this short. Thank you for joining in, folks. We really appreciated the chance of being able to share this with you. So just to summarise, we believe this approach does several things. It draws on best practice foundations from previous programmes. It aligns that with a more forward-looking and proactive way of managing your health and safety standards, for instance, like regimes along the lines of 45001. It uses value-adding components like coaching, like technology, like specialist elements along the lines of VR. And finally, it involves everyone in your organisation, as it should, in the implementation of the value of safety for everyone who is in your organisation or who is in your business.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to just hand back to David to finish off.
Yeah, thank you, Doug. So we at PHSS, Demura Lawson and Concentris are committed to excellence and safety. We believe that positive behavioural change leads to the creation of a just and positive safety culture. BBS 2.0, we think, can support you on this journey. If you've got any information that you may want from us, some further questions, then either use the Q&A box, as mentioned earlier, or indeed drop us a line, drop us an email, or contact us by phone, and we'll be more than happy to provide some further support information. I'm going to ask Adele just to say a couple of closing remarks, and with that, we'll finish today's webinar. So Adele, could maybe just some closing remarks.
Cheers, David. I just, again, there wasn't really much to add to that, but I just wanted to add one very important point as well. And I think with this behavioural-based safety program in particular, what you can treat it as, it's a keystone habit, right? So it's a keystone habit that not only affects the health and safety side of your business, but it starts looking at other aspects as well. So, I mean, you can, by using this to build a habit of collaboration between everyone, communication between departments, having that coaching element, having that element of leadership improve other aspects of your business. So you can start looking at, obviously, maintenance items being closed, better look at quality. You start looking at better productivity, better efficiency in general. And that's one of the important values that that a lot of people don't see when it comes to behavioral based safety program. You just see it as, okay, it's another safety thing. But once you get it right, and that obviously that a keystone habit has been set, you know, it starts affecting those other sides of your business as well. So I think that's really the final word I would leave it at. Again, David, and thank you very much for both of you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Adele. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. Thanks to Adele and Douglas for the support on the webinar, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.